Did you know that the second greatest disgrace the Allies suffered was after the end of World War II? In the bloody aftermath of the war, the Allies were determined to make an example out of the Nazis. The executions that would follow turned out to be highly controversial. Why did the victors choose to spit on the losers in that way? Also, why did the rest of the world call the executions a farce? By the end of this video, your eyes would have been open to the dirty game of politics surrounding the trial of the Nazi leaders. The plots and schemes tied to this highly publicized event will have you sick to your stomach. Few events are more terrifying than the infamous execution of high-ranking Nazi officials at the end of the Second World War. The drama produced by the aftermath was second only to the drama of the war itself. After Hermann Göring, a close associate of Hitler and a man described as nothing but a monster, was found guilty of war crimes at the infamous Nuremberg trial, he knew that he had to do something drastic. He was the Reichsmarschall and the second highest-ranking Nazi on trial after Admiral Dönitz. This old monster knew his way around the world, and he was prepared to cheat justice as always. On the morning of his execution, Göring was found dead in his cell after taking a cyanide pill to kill himself. We're talking about someone who was under meticulous guard by the United States for over a year. How is it possible that he was able to find cyanide on the eve of his execution? Were his guards that incompetent? Later on in this video, we're going to take a closer look at the root of this mystery. But before we continue, it would be best to give you an idea of just how important this event was in the history of the world. After the end of the Great War, a number of allies gathered at the demolished city of Nuremberg for the purpose of bringing Nazi war criminals to justice. Before the trials, the Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, who was well known for his brutality, proposed the execution of over 100,000 German officers. The rest of the allies were not having it. The British Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, had a different idea. What do you think it was? Before you answer that, know that Churchill was a direct, straight-to-the-point man. This was the Nazis they were dealing with here. To him, the answer was obvious. His solution was to execute only the high-ranking Nazis. And without a trial, too. Not a bad idea, right? Wrong! While this seemed like a good idea at the time, it would have made the international community go ballistic. Eventually, the American leaders ended up talking some sense to the Russians and Brits. They decided a criminal trial would be more effective and set a better precedent, too. To understand the importance of this decision, let's give you some historical context. Some of these men had lived through not one, but two of the greatest wars in history, and this was just within the span of a few years. For all they knew, there could have been a third world war just around the corner. Any decision they made would affect generations for years to come. It had to be done right. Among other advantages, there was something about the trials that made it a really good idea. Importantly, the proceedings would require proper documentation of the crimes these defendants had committed. This meant that no one could come years later to argue that these defendants, some who were obviously the most evil human beings on Earth, were condemned without evidence.
We're looking at you, Hermann Göring.
This was an excellent initiative, but there were a number of difficulties to overcome before the Nuremberg trials could be set up. First of all, this was the first time something like this had ever been done. Think of it this way. Imagine that while watching this video, you were suddenly teleported to a courtroom, dressed in lawyer robes, and asked to defend a serial killer. Would you have any idea what to do? Exactly. There were some instances of prosecution of war crimes in the past. For instance, after the American Civil War, a Confederate Army officer was tried and executed for his maltreatment of Union prisoners. The problem with this trial was it conducted according to the laws of a single nation. With the Nuremberg trials, we had a cocktail of four nations with different laws and cultures on our hands: Britain, the Soviet Union, France, and the United States. That's not a weak lineup by any measure. Obviously, these four nations had to find some common ground if the legal proceedings were to go smoothly. No one wanted to start yet another war over this. This unique situation meant that a whole new set of laws had to be developed for the procedures. After sorting out the laws, they had to pick a location for the trials. They needed somewhere very impactful. Think of it like a divorcee trying to hurt their ex-spouse in a way that will truly make them suffer. Nuremberg was chosen because of its symbolic value. It was the city where the Third Reich began. In the early days of the Socialist Party, the Nazis held massive propaganda rallies in Nuremberg. This was where their party was born, which was why the Allies thought it would be the perfect place to stage its death. The total number of 24 individuals were charged with crimes in this highly publicized trial. The media consensus was that the whole thing was a sham. To them, the Allies just needed an excuse to execute all the Nazis. But was that the case? Well, that depends on how you look at the end result, which we'll get into a little bit. Apart from the 24 mentioned, 6 organizations, which were deemed criminal, were placed on the hot seat. Among these, the Gestapo, or the secret state police responsible for the systematic oppression of Jews, was the headliner. By this time, Hitler and 2 of his top associates, Heinrich Himmler and Joseph Goebbels, were long dead. They had committed suicide before they could be captured by the Allies. The rest of the Nazis had to face the music. These were men responsible for some of the most horrific crimes witnessed on European soil. Among these were names like Joachim von Ribbentrop, Wilhelm Keitel, Rudolf Hess, Alfred Rosenberg, and several other top officials. Lucky for them, they were allowed to choose their own lawyers. One of the common defense strategies used by the lawyers was accusing the Allies of carrying out victor's justice. This meant the Allies overlooked the crimes committed by their own soldiers while being too harsh on the crimes committed by the Germans. While there was a lot of finger-pointing going on, the Nuremberg trials did have a silver lining. Yeah, as depressing as the whole thing was, it led to the development of something amazing that will help generations to come. The trials saw the introduction of a marvelous technological innovation, which we overlook today. This was the advent of instantaneous translation. It was the first time in history that everyone in a courtroom could get on-the-spot translations of Russian, German, French, and English through headphones, much like we see in UN conferences today. While that may be interesting, it's about time we get to the juice of the matter. What were the results? Who came out alive? How did Göring escape the hand of justice? You can put your mind at ease because that's exactly what we're about to answer. At the end of the day, the tribunal found all 3 of the 24 defendants guilty. 12 of them were sentenced to death, and the rest of them were given prison sentences going from as little as 10 years to life behind bars. One little fact about the executions is that the death sentences imposed on the prisoners were carried out by one sergeant called John Woods. When interviewed by a reporter from Time magazine, he didn't hide the fact that he was proud of his work. Here is what he had to say. "The way I look at this hanging job, somebody has to do it. 10 men in 103 minutes. That's fast work." Surprisingly, 3 of the Nazi leaders who were tried were cleared of their charges. You can call that a victory for international law. Hey, at least it wasn't as bad as killing all the Nazis on the spot, right? Right? Let us know what you think about the trials in the comments section so we can be sure. Meanwhile, the suicide of Hitler's next in line still remains a mystery. The head of the Luftwaffe was able to commit suicide the night before his execution. But how was he able to get it past the guards who watched him 24/7? This mystery plagued the Allies and the world at large. For a while, it seemed that no one would be able to answer this question, until he came forward. As luck would have it, a former US guard confessed that he was the one who unknowingly gave Göring the pill. That guard, known as Herbert Lee Stivers, was 19 years old at the time of the trials. He claimed he was talked into it after interacting with a flirtatious girl who claimed it was a skin medication. No surprises there. According to Stivers, he met this girl in the streets of Nuremberg. She was apparently swooned by his role as a guard at the trials. This must have gotten to his head quite a bit because the next thing you know, she introduced him to 2 men who asked him to deliver messages to Göring in a fountain pen. The 3rd time he delivered the fountain pen, it contained a pill. They told him that it was medication Göring desperately needed. Being the kind-hearted teenager he was, and hoping to score some points with the pretty German girl, Stivers delivered the message. He never saw her again after that. This must be why our mothers always warned us to be careful around women. Well, there you have it. What do you think about the Nuremberg executions? If you enjoyed this video, Check out this other shocking part of history we covered in the past.